This is a review of The Cinema of George Lucas, written by Marcus Hearn and published by Abrams in 2005. Abrams previously published a book in the 90s called George Lucas: The Creative Impulse, which I've already reviewed. I am going to be making a lot of comparisons between the two books, so I would say it might be helpful to have seen that video for context. However, I'm not sure it's worth wasting your time watching it, as it's not a good book. But at least now you're aware of it. And just to make things clear, for this review, when I use the term this book, I'm referring to the cinema of George Lucas, whereas when I say that book or the other book, I'm referring to the creative impulse. So this book, like that book, is not a biography of George Lucas's personal life. It's a history of his work and career, though there is obviously significant overlap, but specifically, the main focus is on the movies he's directed, and then a little bit on each of the movies he's produced, and then even less on his work as a mogul and industry leader. Also, this is not a book of film school, film theory analysis of the films or their importance on the industry and pop culture or any pompous nonsense like that. It's just pure history and making of. In terms of getting a good idea of how the book allocates its focus, it breaks down pretty evenly into 4 distinct quarters. The first quarter is on his early life, student films, and up to the release of American Graffiti. So the text throughout the book, conceptually, in terms of its focus and overall ideas, is quite weak and misguided. We'll get to that later. But in terms of the moment-to-moment writing, it's outstanding. It is a constant waterfall of wonderful information and quotes with next to nothing that's uninteresting or a waste of time. It's great that even though the book attempts to cover a larger area than it can handle, it still manages to keep its head above water by ensuring the information is constantly specific and detail-focused. Additionally, Marcus Hearn's style of writing in this book is perfect. He writes like a serious but very readable historian rather than the insufferable journalistic style used by most film book authors. There's no sense of his presence, not trying to be clever or punchy or in any way being annoying with his tone and style. It's plain, professional, serious, simple, and direct, but never dry because the information and anecdotes are so well chosen and delivered with an easy narrative flow. The attention to good research and scholarship I found particularly impressive. The book is very focused on dates and so offers a great timeline and telling you exactly when something happened. Like for most of the movies George directed, we're presented with a listing of the shooting schedules. Those are going to be of interest to approximately 5 people in the entire world, which doesn't even include me, but I so appreciate that sort of attention to thoroughness and presenting of complete primary sources. Marcus has drawn from a lot of well-known sources, but also plenty of rarer sources. And then the main thing that gives this book essentially its entire value is the emphasis on drawing on previously unpublished interviews and sources. He's taken really great advantage of his access to those resources and seems to prioritize that stuff and acknowledge that that's what the book and readers will benefit from most, which is awesome. There's also an incredibly helpful notes section at the end that gives the origin of every quote taken from other sources. This style of writing, attention to good scholarship research, and presented in a date-obsessed chronology may remind you a lot of J.W. Rinzler's books, which I'm just assuming you've read because otherwise, what's wrong with you? Rinzler's also the executive editor on this book, and his books are pretty important when discussing this one, because the entire second quarter of this book is dedicated to A New Hope. It's the largest single area of focus. And in 2005, when this book was released, almost certainly one of the best published sources of information on that movie. The problem is, 2 years later, Rinzler released his Making of Star Wars book, which is not only entirely dedicated to the making of A New Hope, but also the uncontested best making of book ever made, which means it utterly destroyed the value of this entire quarter of the cinema of George Lucas. Add to that Rinzler's books on Empire, Jedi, and the Indiana Jones movies, which do the same to those sections in this book. That's a lot of this book being made redundant, particularly damaging because those are the big ticket titles that are going to be attracting people to this book. Now, of course, you have to give this book due credit for how much more valuable it would have been at the time, and if I were reviewing the book in 2005, I would have been ecstatic about that stuff. It's not any failing of the book or the author that since its publication better sources have come out, and that a lot of its once exclusive, unpublished information has since made its way into other sources. However, for the reader of today, the fact is is a significant portion of this book has been made redundant due to being superseded by better sources. Having said that, if you are a serious Star Wars or Indiana Jones scholar, there are still quotes, facts, and little details in here that aren't in Rinzler's books and I haven't read anywhere else, but we're talking like 5%. It's interesting, all this got me thinking about the nature of these kind of books on individual filmmakers, because the coverage in this book for each of the movies that George directed kind of just feel like mini making of books. Ditto, the coverage on many of the movies he's produced a sort of micro making of books, by which I mean it feels more like you're reading a brief history of the production rather than just strictly focusing on George's work and involvement on them. He's obviously the central figure in this book, but not really any more than a writer, director, producer would be in a typical making of book on an individual film. And obviously in those books, they don't just focus on the director, right? They dedicate plenty of space to what everyone else on the production is doing. And this book probably does too much of the same thing, which is why it feels like a collection of mini making of books rather than a book just on George Lucas. And so I think it would have been much wiser for this book to just stay unwaveringly on George and his journey making the movies, and avoid wandering away to discuss what anyone else was doing. This would have, 1, kept the focus on the title subject a lot tighter, 2, ensure the precious space of the book is not being wasted on information outside the purview of the subject, and most importantly, 3, having a book that just focuses on the journey and direct work of the filmmaker is what would help distinguish a book on an individual filmmaker from, and prevent it from, being undermined by a normal making of book that is able to cover a whole single production more robustly. And so it feels like George Lucas as a subject is being used as the glue that holds together and links the brief overview of the history of each production, rather than solely being about his journey and contributions. Though, as far as being glue goes, the book uses George as a good through line to offer an interesting and valuable perspective in a way that making of books on individual movies tend not to, and that is giving a more realistic and insightful view of the links and crossover between the different projects and how they impact and influence one another. The book's third quarter covers from after the release of A New Hope up to the start of the prequel trilogy, so it covers Empire, Jedi, the special editions, the Ewok movies and Star Wars cartoons, all the Indiana Jones movies and the Young Indie TV show, Willow, Labyrinth, Howard the Duck, Radioland Murders, and more than half a dozen other projects. All the stuff he did with the Disney parks and the formation and development of all his companies, that is an absurd amount of stuff to cram into like 60 pages, and it feels like it. The biggest productions get a page or two, and some of the smaller ones get maybe a paragraph. Meanwhile, the different companies and facilities he created get quarter-page sidebars. And so in this respect, the book is no better than The Creative Impulse, even offering less in some cases, which I wouldn't have thought possible. It's just such a shame, because on the one hand, the information itself is still primo. At any given moment, you'll be reading something interesting. But on the other hand, the pacing is ridiculous, with everything flashing by in a way that makes it largely unsatisfying, feeling like a glorified Lucasfilm trivia book rather than a focused, meaningful exploration. That's not decisively a bad thing, as long as that's what you'll be happy with. But I spoke about this a lot in the review of the other book, how it's even more of a disappointment, because I think these areas are more deserving of this space and the most interesting and valuable, in the sense that they are the road less traveled, because of course Star Wars and Indy are the most important and interesting, but they already have their own sources and always get the lion's share of focus elsewhere. Whereas this book presents really the only opportunity to discuss George's involvement with these smaller productions, and even more importantly, his creation of these companies and introducing filmmaking innovations. George Lucas as a creative and entrepreneur, his ability to establish an empire, foster projects, technologies, and facilities the way he wants, and have that influence the industry as a whole. There is no other single figure of his generation who has been as impactful an industry leader. Corporate stuff is obviously not as magical as making the movies, but it's what allows the magic to happen, and it's his marriage of artistic and corporate ventures that gained him this autonomy and makes him unique as a subject. And so for both of these books to not take advantage of that and have that be their primary focus, and instead just barely scratch the surface, done at the expense of focusing on overall less important / already covered topics, seems like a perplexing missed opportunity and disservice to the subject, book, the reader, and the literature as a whole. So then we get to the last quarter of the book, which is all about the prequels. Well, Okay, so all the issues and potential dissatisfactions of the book I've mentioned so far, I think of them as being innocently misguided. I acknowledge and appreciate that serious, commendable effort has gone into attempting to produce something of genuine quality and value. Whether or not it actually succeeds is debatable, but I think its missteps are at least understandable and so elicit disappointment rather than ire, as opposed to the other George Lucas book where the author and publisher had the audacity to try and sell us an actual poorly made, lazy piece of crap twice. However, there are three things this book does that are worthy of genuine condemnation and should be embarrassed by. The first is the significant poor use of space. Now, it's a trillion times better than the abomination we saw in the other book, but it still does some pretty cheap and stupid things where it should know better, especially considering it's a book clearly biting off more than it can chew. If you're going to attempt something as futile as trying to cover this much stuff, every inch has to be accounted for, or you might as well not even bother. You look at Rinzler's books and it's their appropriately modest-sized font and image size that allows those books to cover so much in a satisfying way, whereas this book feels half-hearted, if not outright negligent at times as far as its attempt to make the best use of space and content. The main issue being unnecessarily large images taking up way too much space throughout the book. It's particularly bad in the prequel section with the added insult of too many stills, which wasn't really a problem with the rest of the book. Otherwise, the images in this book are an overall brilliant selection, lots of really great stuff I don't recall seeing before. But it's the way they're used that's the problem, because not only do we have images that are way too large, but bizarrely and conversely, also images that are insanely small. You'll have seen as we've gone through that running along the bottom are all these thumbnail images. It's preposterous. Having concept art and behind the scenes images this small, while having a simultaneous epidemic of images that are ridiculously large. But the thing that truly pisses me off in a way that nothing else in this book did, is that Revenge of the Sith, for all actual intents and purposes, is not here. At the end you'll see a bunch of photos from episode 3, but the text for it is half a page saying nothing more than the dates pre-production, production and post-production started. It's the only movie George directed that doesn't include the shooting schedule either. So this is a book that's primary focus has been on the movies George Lucas directed, done at the expense of neglecting the other areas of his career, yet when we get to his last movie, it just goes, yeah, forget it. That is some serious bullshit. This book came out 2 months ahead of Revenge of the Sith, obviously in an effort to tie in and make money off that. But why? There was already an awesome Revenge of the Sith making of book that they tried to ruin by rushing it to come out ahead of the movie, so why did they also need to rush this book to tie in with the movie's release? Especially because of the ridiculous irony that in doing so, it doesn't really have anything on Revenge of the Sith anyway. For the book to end on this note left a bitter taste that seriously undermined my overall opinion of the book. But anyway, even that aside, I still found the stuff on episodes 1 and 2 to be very weak. Even just the quality of the writing dips noticeably for some reason. But, like so much of the book, it's still mostly really great info, rendered ultimately unfulfilling when considering how quick it all is, that most of the focus is not on George Lucas, and that they are much better covered in their own making of books and DVD features. Like every other section in the book, it contains information, details, photos, quotes not featured in those other sources, which is definitely worth something, I guess. Just not much. Then the last thing I found very unimpressive is that, just like the other book, the Star Wars Holiday Special isn't even mentioned. I realize George had very little to do with the special, but no less than some of the other projects that are mentioned. So it's kind of a Streisand effect thing. Its absence calls attention to itself when, had they just included a one-sentence reference that it was based on a story by George, I wouldn't have thought any more on it. But to now have 2 books that are otherwise comprehensive catalogues completely and obviously omit any reference is suspicious and annoying, because even though it's such a minor thing, and I obviously don't actually care about the holiday special specifically in that it wasn't given due attention, but what I do care about is that to me it's a stigma that discredits the rest of the book, because this is no longer a definitive source if it's going to blatantly and dishonorably omit certain parts. And it really undermines everything I've said about Marcus Hearn being a great historian, though given George's comments elsewhere regarding his feelings about the special, I suspect expunging it from the books was a mandate from Lucasfilm or George himself, though it has appeared in other Star Wars books. At any rate, it's worth keeping in mind that, as with any official book, it adheres to an agenda in what it presents and how. So if you do want a more gritty, critical, uncensored account that's perhaps more accurate in some respects, there are a couple of other non-visual and unofficial biographies on George Lucas. Comparing all the books would require its own video, but suffice it to say, some people may actually prefer those books. They even address some of the areas of dissatisfaction I have with this book, but in terms of like a personal recommendation, I really don't have one. I do not like the style any of them are written in, and find Marcus Hearn still to be by far the most professional and enjoyable to read. Plus, this book's got the best/most pictures. So, for my money, The Cinema of George Lucas, though not exactly ideal, is still easily the one I like best. Even so, this book is a precariously mixed bag, to say the least. So assessing if you're going to get enough out of it is difficult, because Indiana Jones and Star Wars, unless you're an obsessive or historian who needs every last detail, Rinzler's books makes that stuff redundant. Even American Graffiti, I'd say 80% is already featured in the making of documentary on the DVD. I can't say that's the case for THX because I haven't seen the DVD features for that. And then, like I said, every other production and George's corporate ventures are completely inadequate if that's all you're interested in. So between spreading itself too thin, inefficient use of space, Rinzler's books, and lots of repeating of well-known stuff from other sources, the book is very limited in what it can offer. So I ultimately don't think it's successful. But those disappointments aside, I do not regret getting it. I still find it valuable as a resource, as a reference for George Lucas's work. It's impossible to assess for everyone, but personally I found there to be enough quality information I've not come across elsewhere for it to be worth it. But that's only because I'm interested in everything the book covers. If you're only interested in several areas of the books, the info may be great, but it's going to be a pinch of gold dust rather than a wholly satisfying experience. So, like me, you have to be interested in all the components this book discusses, gathering up the gold dust for each of them, at which point you'll ideally have amassed enough for the book to have been worth it.